Dr. James Bennett strode through the pristine corridors of Massachusetts General Hospital with the confident gait of a man who knew his worth, down to the penny. His Italian leather shoes clicked against the polished floor, echoing his impatience as he checked his Patek Philippe watch for the third time in as many minutes. "Dr. Bennett!" A breathless resident hurried alongside him, clutching a tablet. "The Stevenson family is asking for a second consultation about the—" "Tell them my diagnosis stands," James cut in without breaking stride. "If they want a second opinion, Dr. Ramirez is excellent, though she'll tell them exactly what I did." The resident nodded, still trailing him. "Also, your attorney called. Said it's urgent about your uncle's—" James stopped so abruptly that the young doctor nearly collided with him. "My uncle." A crease formed between his perfectly groomed eyebrows. "Which one?" "He didn't say, just that it's about an inheritance, and you need to call back immediately." James sighed, extracting his phone from his lab coat. "Reschedule my 4 o'clock, and make sure Henderson reviews the Mitchell scans before tomorrow's surgery." Alone in his office, a corner space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Boston Harbor, James loosened his tie and dialed his attorney. Inheritance? The only uncle he could think of was William, his father's eccentric younger brother who disappeared to find himself somewhere in the South decades ago. They hadn't spoken since James was 12, when William had attended his father's funeral in jeans and a flannel shirt, much to his mother's horror. "Ah, James," his attorney, Richard, answered on the second ring. "Thank you for calling back promptly." "What's this about an inheritance?" James asked, rotating his ergonomic chair to face the harbor. "Your Uncle William passed away 3 weeks ago in Tennessee. Heart attack, apparently. His will was just processed and, well, he's left you his property in Oak Ridge." James frowned. "Oak Ridge? Small town about an hour outside Nashville. Apparently he's been living there for the past 20 years. And he left me property?" James couldn't hide his surprise. "What kind of property are we talking about? Value?" Richard cleared his throat. "The details are somewhat limited. It's a parcel of land with a residence. I don't have a formal appraisal, but given the area, it could be quite valuable for development. Rural property near Nashville has been appreciating nicely." A slight smile tugged at James's lips. "Perhaps this unexpected inheritance might actually be worth his time. What do I need to do?" "You'll need to go in person to handle the deed transfer and sign some paperwork. I've arranged everything with the local attorney who handled your uncle's will. His name is Frank Thompson." James's smile vanished. "Go there, in person. Can't we handle this remotely?" "Unfortunately not. There are some specific provisions that require your physical presence, and you'll want to inspect the property before deciding what to do with it." James glanced at his calendar on the wall, methodically organized into color-coded blocks. He had surgeries scheduled for the next 3 weeks, board meetings, and a keynote speech at a neurosurgery conference in Chicago. "When?" he asked, already calculating which commitments could be rescheduled. "The sooner the better. There's apparently another party with some interest in the property." James frowned. "What does that mean? Is the inheritance contested?" "Not legally, no. The property is definitively yours, but there might be complications. It would be best to handle this promptly." 3 days later, James found himself behind the wheel of a rented Mercedes SUV, navigating the winding roads of rural Tennessee. The GPS on his phone had lost signal twice, forcing him to rely on the crumpled directions the car rental agent had scribbled for him. The late April landscape was undeniably beautiful, with rolling hills covered in vibrant green and wildflowers dotting the roadside, but James barely noticed. His mind was occupied with the surgeries he'd rescheduled and the research paper deadline he was likely to miss. "In 1 mile, turn right onto Willow Creek Road," his GPS suddenly announced, having regained signal. The paved road soon gave way to gravel, and James winced as small stones pinged against the Mercedes's pristine paint. After another 10 minutes of increasingly rural scenery, he spotted a wooden sign reading, "Oak Ridge, Pop, 578, and suppressed a groan. The town centre, if it could be called that, consisted of a handful of buildings clustered around a small square, a general store with a post office inside, a diner called Mabel's, a tiny library, and a white clapboard building labelled Thompson Law and Notary. James parked in front of the law office and checked his appearance in the rearview mirror. Despite the 4-hour flight and 2-hour drive, he looked immaculate in his tailored navy suit. He took a deep breath and stepped out into the warm southern air. The bell above the door jingled as he entered the law office. Inside, a ceiling fan spun lazily, stirring the cool air. A woman in her 60s looked up from behind a desk cluttered with papers and family photos. "Well, hello there," she greeted with a warm smile. "You must be Dr. Bennett." "I'm Martha, Frank's assistant and wife of 43 years. She extended a hand. "Frank's expecting you." James shook her hand, noting the firm grip that belied her grandmotherly appearance. "Pleasure to meet you. Can I get you some sweet tea before you go in? You look like you could use some refreshment after your journey." "No, thank you," James replied curtly. "I'd prefer to handle this matter as efficiently as possible." Martha's smile didn't falter. "Of course, honey. Right this way." She led him to a door at the back of the office and knocked once before opening it. "Frank, Dr. Bennett is here." Frank Thompson was a barrel-chested man with salt and pepper hair and reading glasses perched on his nose. He stood from behind his desk, which was even more cluttered than his wife's, and extended a hand. "Dr. Bennett, welcome to Oak Ridge. Please have a seat." James sat in one of the leather chairs facing the desk, placing his briefcase on his lap. "Mr. Thompson, I understand you have paperwork for me regarding my uncle's property." "Indeed I do." Frank settled back into his chair. "But first, let me express my condolences for your loss. William was a beloved figure in our community." James shifted uncomfortably. "Thank you, but I'm afraid I barely knew him. We hadn't spoken in over 20 years. Frank nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, William mentioned that. Still, blood is blood." "About the property," James prompted. "Yes, of course." Frank opened a folder. "William's place is about 3 miles outside town. 15 acres of land, most of it wooded, with a small cottage and a workshop where he did his woodworking." James's interest peaked at 15 acres. That was more substantial than he'd expected. "And the value?" Frank's eyes twinkled with amusement. "Well now, that depends on what you're looking to do with it. As raw land for development, you might get a decent price, though it's not directly on the road. As a retreat or vacation property, it has other kinds of value." "I'll be selling it," James stated flatly. "I live and work in Boston. I have no use for rural property in Tennessee." Frank's expression sobered. "I see. Well, before we proceed, there's something you should know. William's will has a specific condition." James felt a headache forming behind his right eye. "What condition?" "You need to stay at the property for at least 3 days before you can sell it." 3 days? James repeated incredulously. "That's ridiculous. I can't possibly—" "It's non-negotiable, I'm afraid," Frank interrupted gently. William was quite clear. "You inherit the property only if you stay there for a minimum of 3 consecutive days. Otherwise, it goes to his secondary beneficiary." James's jaw tightened. "And who might that be?" "A local woman named Abigail Foster. She was William's neighbor and caretaker during his final years." "This is absurd," James muttered. "My uncle, whom I haven't seen in 2 decades, expects me to drop everything and camp out in some rural cottage for 3 days?" "Not camping, Dr. Bennett. The cottage is fully furnished and quite comfortable. William renovated it himself." Frank smiled sympathetically. "Look at it this way. 3 days is a small price to pay for 15 acres of prime Tennessee land," James calculated quickly. If he stayed tonight, tomorrow, and left on the 3rd day, he could still make it back for his Thursday morning surgery. It was inconvenient, but manageable. "Fine," he conceded. "Where do I sign?" Half an hour later, armed with keys and directions to the property, James climbed back into his rental car. His conversation with Frank had been enlightening, but frustrating. The lawyer had been maddeningly vague about the property's exact value, only saying it was special and that he should keep an open mind. Following the hand-drawn map, James drove deeper into the countryside. The paved road eventually ended, transitioning to a dirt track that wound through dense woods. Just as he was beginning to think he'd taken a wrong turn, the trees opened up to reveal a clearing. James slowed the car, taking in the scene before him. A small cottage with a stone foundation and wooden siding stood in the middle of the clearing. A covered porch wrapped around the front, complete with a swing and rocking chairs. To the side stood a larger structure that must be the workshop Frank had mentioned. Behind the cottage, the land sloped gently toward what appeared to be a small pond. It was charming in a rustic way, but hardly seemed like valuable real estate. James parked beside the cottage and stepped out, immediately noticing the silence. No traffic noise, no sirens, just birds and the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. As he retrieved his overnight bag from the trunk, movement caught his eye. A woman was walking up the path from the direction of the pond. She was heavily pregnant, probably in her third trimester, with honey blonde hair pulled back in a messy bun. She wore denim overalls over a floral print shirt and carried a basket of what looked like herbs. She stopped when she saw him, her expression transitioning from surprise to something harder to read. "You must be the nephew," she called out, continuing her approach. Her accent was distinctly southern, but not overly strong. "Dr. James Bennett," he confirmed, setting down his bag and extending a hand as she reached him. "Abigail Foster. Most folks call me Abby." She shifted her basket to shake his hand briefly. Her palm was warm and slightly calloused. "I wasn't expecting you until tomorrow." Something in her tone suggested she wasn't particularly pleased by his early arrival. "You're the neighbor? The secondary beneficiary?" She nodded, studying him with clear blue eyes that seemed to take his measure. "That's right, though I was more than just a neighbor to William." James felt a flash of irritation at her implied intimacy with an uncle he barely remembered. "Well, Ms. Foster, I'm here to fulfill the conditions of the will, and then I'll be putting this property on the market." Abby's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. "Is that so? Well, you might want to have a look inside first." She gestured toward the cottage with her free hand. "Would you like me to show you around?" "That won't be necessary," James replied coolly. "I'm perfectly capable of finding my way around a small cottage." Abby raised an eyebrow. "Suit yourself, Dr. Bennett. The generator's around back if you need power. William didn't believe in being on the grid, but there's running water from the well. The kitchen's stocked. I made sure of that when Frank told me you were coming." She paused, then added, "The key can be tricky. You have to jiggle it while pushing on the door." With that, she turned and walked toward a narrow path leading into the woods. "My place is just through those trees if you need anything," she called over her shoulder. "Though I suspect a big city doctor like yourself will manage just fine." James watched her go, feeling oddly dismissed. He turned toward the cottage, key in hand, and approached the front door. The wooden steps of the porch creaked under his weight. The porch itself was swept clean, with potted plants hanging from hooks in the ceiling and a worn but comfortable-looking porch swing gently swaying in the breeze. The key did indeed prove tricky, requiring several attempts before the lock finally turned. James pushed open the door and stepped inside, immediately struck by the warm, woody scent of the interior. Sunlight streamed through windows on both sides, illuminating an open-concept living area that was far more charming than he'd expected. Hand-hewn wooden beams crossed the ceiling. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, flanked by built-in bookshelves filled with volumes on nature, woodworking, and local history. The furniture was clearly handcrafted, a rustic dining table with chairs, a comfortable-looking sofa, and various side tables and cabinets, all showing the skilled workmanship that must have been his uncle's. James moved further inside, his designer shoes silent on the polished wooden floors. The kitchen was small but well-appointed, with a vintage-style refrigerator humming softly. He opened it to find fresh milk, eggs, butter, and various containers labeled in neat handwriting: beef stew, apple pie, chicken salad. Clearly, Abigail Foster had indeed stocked the place for his arrival, despite her apparent displeasure at his presence. A short hallway led to a bathroom with a clawfoot tub and a surprisingly modern shower attachment, and beyond that, a bedroom with a queen-sized bed covered in a handmade quilt. A second, smaller bedroom had been converted into a study, with a desk positioned to overlook the pond through a large window. It was all undeniably well-crafted and maintained, but James couldn't shake the feeling that he was intruding in someone else's space. His uncle's presence seemed to permeate every corner, from the books on the shelves to the hand-carved wooden duck decoys arranged on the mantel. Back in the main room, James noticed a framed photograph on one of the bookshelves. He picked it up, dust motes dancing in the sunbeam as he moved it. The picture showed a much younger version of his uncle, arm around a boy of about 10 or 11. With a jolt, James recognized himself. The fishing trip to Maine, the summer before his father died. He set the photograph down carefully, an unexpected lump forming in his throat. He couldn't recall seeing that picture before. His mother must have sent it to William at some point. Turning away from the bookshelf, James spotted an envelope on the dining table with his name written on it in an unfamiliar hand. He opened it to find a brief note. "James, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you've made the journey to my little piece of heaven. I know we lost touch over the years, my fault more than yours. Life takes unexpected turns. This place may not look like much to a successful man like yourself, but it's been my true home. I'm leaving it to you not as a burden, but as a gift. Take the 3 days, walk the land, open the workshop. You might be surprised by what you find. Your uncle, William P.S. Be kind to Abby. She's got a big heart and a stubborn streak a mile wide. Reminds me of your father." James refolded the note, feeling a complex mix of emotions he couldn't quite name. He glanced out the window toward the path Abigail had taken. What exactly had been her relationship with his uncle, and why had William felt the need to ask for kindness toward her? As the afternoon sun slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor, James realized he was hungrier than he'd thought. Opening one of the containers from the refrigerator, the beef stew, he found a pot in the kitchen and set about heating it up on the old but functional gas stove. The stew was hearty and flavorful, clearly homemade, with tender chunks of beef, potatoes, carrots, and herbs that tasted fresher than anything he'd eaten in recent memory. As he ate alone at the table his uncle had crafted, James couldn't help but wonder what exactly he'd inherited and what secrets this small cottage might hold. Morning arrived with the persistent chirping of birds and sunlight streaming through curtains James had forgotten to close the night before. For a disorienting moment, he stared at the unfamiliar wooden ceiling, trying to place himself. Then it all came flooding back: the inheritance, the cottage, the pregnant neighbor with the challenging gaze. He reached for his phone on the bedside table. No signal, of course. His watch, however, informed him it was 6:37, earlier than he'd typically rise on a day without surgery scheduled. Yet he felt surprisingly rested after sleeping in the handcrafted bed with its unexpectedly comfortable mattress. After a quick shower in the clawfoot tub, James dressed in the most casual clothes he'd packed: khaki pants and a light blue button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up. He'd brought no proper casual wear, having planned this as a brief business trip. In the kitchen, he found coffee beans and a grinder beside a French press. The process of making coffee this way was unfamiliar. At home, his programmable machine would have had a cup waiting, but he managed. The resulting brew was strong and flavorful, putting his expensive imported beans to shame. As he sipped his coffee on the front porch, watching the morning mist rise from the pond, James tried to formulate a plan for the day. The first of his mandatory 3 days on the property. He needed to inspect the land more thoroughly to assess its value. He should also check out this workshop that Frank and his uncle's note had mentioned. The sound of tires on gravel interrupted his thoughts. A battered blue pickup truck was making its way up the dirt drive, dust billowing behind it. It came to a stop beside his rental, and Abigail Foster climbed out with surprising agility for someone in her condition. Today she wore a loose sundress over leggings, her hair braided away from her face. She carried a basket covered with a checkered cloth. "Morning," she called, approaching the porch. "Thought you might want some real breakfast. I'm guessing you don't cook much." "I manage," James replied, though in truth his culinary skills extended little beyond scrambled eggs and toast. Most of his meals came from the hospital cafeteria or delivery services. "Well, these biscuits won't eat themselves." She climbed the steps and set the basket on the small table beside his chair. The scent wafting from beneath the cloth made his stomach growl embarrassingly. "Thank you," he said, making an effort to sound sincere. "The stew last night was excellent." Abby looked pleased, despite herself. "Family recipe. William loved it." She hesitated, then gestured to the other chair. "Mind if I sit a spell? The little one's been dancing on my bladder since dawn." "Please." James indicated the chair, watching as she lowered herself into it with a small sigh of relief. "So," she said, uncovering the basket to reveal golden brown biscuits, a jar of honey, and what looked like homemade jam. "What do you think of your inheritance?" James chose his words carefully. "It's charming, not what I expected. Uncle William clearly put a lot of work into it." "Aye, 23 years' worth," Abby confirmed, pushing the basket toward him. "He bought this land when it was nothing but scrub and trees. Built everything you see with his own 2 hands. James took a biscuit, still warm from the oven. "You knew him well?" "I grew up on the neighboring property. My grandparents' farm backs up to this land. William was like family to us." She unscrewed the jam jar, offering it to him. "Blackberry, from the bushes down by the pond." The biscuit was light and buttery, the jam perfectly balanced between tart and sweet. James couldn't remember the last time he'd tasted something so simple, yet so satisfying. "These are incredible," he admitted. "Just flour, buttermilk, and butter." Abby shrugged, but looked pleased. "Nothing fancy." "You said you were more than just a neighbor to my uncle," James ventured. "Were you two?" Abby's laugh cut him off. "Lord, no, nothing like that. William was 73, for goodness sake. He was more like a father to me after my dad passed. Taught me everything from fixing a carburetor to identifying edible mushrooms." Her expression softened. "He was there for me when my husband left. Said any man who'd abandon his pregnant wife didn't deserve either of us." James felt a stab of something that might have been guilt. Here was yet another facet of his uncle's life he knew nothing about. "I'm sorry about your husband." Abby waved a hand dismissively. "Don't be. Tyler was a charmer but had the backbone of a jellyfish. Got scared when the pregnancy test came back positive and ran off to Nashville with a cocktail waitress." She patted her rounded belly. "His loss. This little girl is going to be amazing without him." "A girl?" James found himself asking. Due in 6 weeks." Her eyes met his, challenging. "Which is why I've been fixing up William's old workshop. I'm taking over his furniture business." James blinked. "His what? You don't know?" Abby looked genuinely surprised. "Your uncle was William Bennett of Willow Creek Woodworking. His pieces sell to collectors all over the country. He's got a waiting list 2 years long." James stared at her, certain she was exaggerating. "My uncle was a furniture maker?" Not just any furniture maker," Abby said, her tone suggesting he was missing something obvious. "He won the American Craft Council Award 3 times. His rocking chairs go for $20,000 apiece." 20,000? James couldn't finish the sentence. His mind raced, recalculating the value of his inheritance. If what she was saying was true, the business alone could be worth substantially more than the property. "You really didn't know," Abby said softly, studying his face. "He said you wouldn't, that you probably thought he was just some hermit living off-grid in the woods." James felt a flush of embarrassment. That was exactly what he'd thought. "My mother, after my father died, she didn't speak of William. I think she blamed him somehow. Abby nodded, as if this confirmed something. William said Eleanor never forgave him for encouraging your father to take that sailing trip. The accident, the unexpected storm that had claimed his father's life when James was just 11. He'd never known his uncle was supposed to have been on that boat too. He was meant to go with them, James asked, his coffee forgotten. Had the flu at the last minute, told your dad to go without him. Abby's voice was gentle. He carried that guilt for the rest of his life. The revelation settled heavily between them. James took another biscuit, needing something to do with his hands. You said you're taking over his business? And I was his apprentice for 5 years, Abby explained. I've been handling the smaller commissions for the past 2. He'd been training me to take over since he had his first heart attack last year. She looked out toward the workshop. That's why I thought, well, it doesn't matter what I thought. But James could guess. She'd expected to inherit the workshop at least, if not the property. And now here he was, the estranged nephew from Boston, planning to sell it all. Would you show me? He asked, surprising himself with the request. The workshop, I mean. Abby regarded him for a long moment, as if assessing his sincerity. All right, she finally agreed, but you should know something first. What's in that workshop isn't just tools and wood. It's William's legacy. And mine too, I suppose. They walked together across the clearing, the morning dew soaking the hem of Abby's dress and James's expensive leather shoes. The workshop was larger than it had appeared from a distance, a 2-story structure with large windows and a metal roof. Abby produced a key from her pocket. William never locked his house, but the shop was sacred space. She unlocked the heavy wooden door and pushed it open, gesturing for James to enter first. The scent hit him immediately. Wood shavings, linseed oil, and something indefinably rich and organic. As his eyes adjusted to the dimmer light, James found himself in a craftsman's paradise. Tools lined the walls in meticulous order, from hand planes to chisels to specialized instruments he couldn't name. Workbenches occupied the center of the space, their surfaces scarred and stained from decades of use. But it was the wood itself that drew his eye. Stacks of lumber, each piece seemingly unique, filled one wall. Some boards were rough cut, others smoothed and ready for use. The varieties and colors astounded him. Honey-colored pine, deep red cherry, chocolate-brown walnut, and exotic woods he couldn't identify. William could tell you where each piece came from, Abby said, running her hand along a particularly beautiful plank with a rippling grain pattern. This one's from a maple tree that fell during the big storm of 2015. He aged it for 7 years before cutting it. It's impressive, James acknowledged, feeling distinctly out of his element. His expertise lay in the delicate structures of the human brain, not in these solid, tactile materials. Come upstairs, Abby suggested, moving toward a wooden staircase in the corner. That's where the magic really happens. The second floor was flooded with natural light from skylights and tall windows, and there, arranged like museum pieces, stood the finished works, chairs, tables, cabinets, and smaller items, each more beautiful than the last. James moved among them in silent appreciation, admiring the clean lines, the perfect joinery, the surfaces that begged to be touched. He paused before a rocking chair, its curves so organic it seemed almost alive. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward it. "It's yours now," Abby reminded him with a hint of bitterness. James sat carefully, feeling the chair accommodate his body as if it had been made specifically for him. When he set it in motion, the rockers met the floor in perfect balance, creating a soothing rhythm. "He called that his Tennessee lullaby design," Abby said, watching him. "Said he designed it thinking of his brother, your father, how he used to rock you to sleep when you were little." The revelation struck James like a physical blow. His father, so often absent during his early years due to the demands of his surgical practice, rocking him to sleep. It contradicted his childhood memories of a distant, driven man. "I don't remember that," he admitted. "William had a photograph on his desk. Your father holding you in a rocker. You couldn't have been more than 2. Abby moved to a small desk in the corner and opened a drawer. Here, she handed him a faded photograph. Sure enough, there was his father, younger than James ever remembered him, sitting in a rocking chair with a toddler asleep against his chest. The tenderness in his expression was something James had never associated with the stern, ambitious man he'd known. "I didn't know," he said softly, returning the photograph. "There's a lot you don't know," Abby replied, not unkindly. "William talked about you, you know. Kept track of your career. He had a whole folder of articles about your surgical innovations. Was proud as could be, even if he didn't understand half the medical terms." James felt something twist in his chest. The idea that his uncle, whom he'd barely thought about in 2 decades, had been following his career from afar was unexpectedly moving. "Why didn't he ever contact me?" he asked. Abby shrugged. "Pride, maybe, or respect for your mother's wishes. He said Eleanor made it clear after the funeral that he wasn't welcome in your lives." She moved toward a large object covered with a drop cloth. "But he never stopped thinking of you. This was his last project." She pulled away the cloth to reveal an unfinished desk. Even in its incomplete state, it was clearly a masterpiece, a large writing desk with drawers and compartments, its surface inlaid with different woods, creating a subtle pattern that reminded James of a neural network. "He was making this for you," Abby said quietly. "Started it after your article in the New England Journal of Medicine last year. Said a man doing such important work deserved a proper desk to write at." James stared at the unfinished piece, emotion threatening to overwhelm him. His uncle, a virtual stranger, had been crafting this beautiful object with him in mind. "I'm a neurosurgeon," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "I spend 14 hours a day in an operating room or reviewing scans. I barely use my desk at home." "That's not the point," Abby said with surprising gentleness. "It wasn't about whether you needed it. It was about him connecting with you the only way he knew how." James ran his hand over the smooth surface of the desk, feeling the subtle transitions between different woods. "Could it be finished?" he asked. "I could finish it," Abby confirmed. "It would take time, but all his notes are there." She patted the side of the desk. He was meticulous about documenting his process. They fell silent. The only sound, the distant call of birds from the woods. James tried to process everything he'd learned in the past hour. His uncle, far from the shiftless drifter his mother had described, had been a respected artisan with a thriving business. He'd kept track of James's life from a distance, proud of his achievements despite their estrangement, and now, ironically, James stood to inherit not just a rustic cottage in the woods, but a valuable business with a reputation for excellence. "I need to make some calls," he said finally. "Is there anywhere in town with reliable cell service?" "Mabel's Diner has Wi-Fi, and there's decent reception in the town square," Abby replied. "But before you go calling real estate agents, there's something else you should see." Her expression had changed, becoming more guarded. "What is it?" James asked, suddenly wary. "It's in the cottage. Something William left specifically for you to find." They made their way back to the cottage in silence, James's mind racing with questions. At the front door, Abby paused. "You should find this on your own," she said, not meeting his eyes. "I'll come back tomorrow morning. Think about what you've learned today before you make any decisions." Before he could respond, she was heading back to her truck, moving with surprising quickness for someone in her condition. James watched her drive away, dust settling in her wake, before turning back to the cottage. What else could his uncle possibly have left for him to find? And why did Abby seem so conflicted about it? Inside, the cottage felt different now that he knew more about the man who had built it. The craftsmanship he had appreciated in passing now took on new significance. Each piece of furniture, each carefully joined corner and smooth surface, represented hours of his uncle's life and expertise. James moved through the room slowly, looking for anything unusual. In the study, he examined the desk more carefully, opening drawers and checking behind books on the shelves. Nothing seemed out of place or obviously meant for him. In the bedroom, he looked under the bed and in the simple dresser. Again, Nothing unusual. Finally, returning to the main room, James noticed something he'd overlooked the previous day. A small wooden box on one of the bookshelves. About the size of a cigar box, it was made of several different woods in a geometric pattern. He lifted it down, feeling its solid weight in his hands. The box opened on hidden hinges to reveal a stack of letters, each in a cream-colored envelope, addressed simply to James. The postmark spanned years, from the time James was 12 until just 3 months ago. With trembling fingers, he lifted out the first letter, dated shortly after his father's funeral. The handwriting was firm and masculine, with a slight rightward slant. Dear James, I'm writing this from a small town in Tennessee, where I've decided to settle for a while. I know your mother doesn't want me in your life right now. She's hurting, and I understand that. But you're my only nephew, and someday, when you're older, I hope we might get to know each other again. I was sorry to miss so much of your childhood while I was traveling. Your father used to send me pictures and tell me stories about you. How smart you are, how determined. When you were 5, he told me you announced you were going to be a doctor like him. He was so proud. I'm enclosing my address in case you ever want to write back. No pressure. I know you have a lot to deal with right now. Your uncle, William James, sank into a chair, the letter trembling in his hands. He picked up the next one, dated 6 months later. Dear James, I saw in the Boston Globe that you won your school science fair with a project on the human circulatory system. Your father would have been bursting with pride. I know I am. I've settled in more permanently here in Tennessee, found a piece of land that speaks to me, if that doesn't sound too strange. I'm learning woodworking from an old craftsman in town. There's something deeply satisfying about creating something with your hands, something solid and useful that will outlast you. My address is still the same if you ever want to write. Your uncle, William, letter after letter, documented the milestones of James's life, his high school graduation, his acceptance to Harvard Medical School, his residency, his first published paper. In each one, William expressed pride and affection for a nephew who never wrote back, never acknowledged these missives, because they had never been sent. The realization hit James like a wave. These weren't letters he'd ignored or his mother had intercepted. They were letters William had written but kept to himself, maintaining a one-sided correspondence with a nephew he would never know. The last letter was dated just 3 months ago, when William must have already known his heart was failing. Dear James, the doctor says my time is growing short. The old ticker that served me for 73 years is finally wearing out. I've made my peace with it. I saw your most recent paper on minimally invasive techniques for removing brain tumors. Even with my limited understanding, I could tell it was revolutionary. You're changing lives, saving people who would have been lost just a few years ago. What a gift that is. I've been thinking a lot about the paths our lives take, the choices we make and the ones that are made for us. I chose to leave after Robert died, to give Eleanor the space she needed. She chose to cut me out of your life. You chose medicine, following in your father's footsteps but blazing your own trail too. Now I'm making one last choice. I'm leaving you this place, this land that healed me when I thought nothing could. You may sell it, and that's your right. But I hope you'll spend a little time here first. Get to know the man your father was before ambition and responsibility hardened him. Get to know the uncle you never had the chance to meet. There's treasure here, but not the kind you might think. Open your eyes, open your heart. You've achieved every external success a man could want. But there are other kinds of riches. With love and pride, your Uncle William James realized he was crying. Silent tears tracking down his cheeks for an uncle he'd never really known, for opportunities lost, for a connection severed before it could truly form. He gathered the letters carefully, returning them to their box, his mind a whirl of conflicting emotions. Outside, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the clearing. James stepped onto the porch, breathing in the scent of pine and wildflowers. For the first time, he really looked at the land around him, not assessing its commercial value, but seeing it as his uncle had. The graceful slope down to the pond, the workshop where William had created objects of lasting beauty, the cottage, modest in size but exquisite in craftsmanship, and somewhere nearby, a pregnant woman who had clearly loved his uncle, who had expected to inherit at least part of this property, who was now facing an uncertain future as a single mother. James sank into one of the rocking chairs, feeling it conform perfectly to his body. What exactly had he inherited here, and what was he going to do with it? As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, James realized that his mandatory 3-day stay had become something else entirely, a reckoning with a past he hadn't known existed, and a future suddenly full of unexpected possibilities. The following morning, James woke before dawn, his mind still processing the revelations from his uncle's letters. He made coffee and took it outside, watching the sun rise over the pond as mist danced across the water's surface. Yesterday's discoveries had shaken his certainty about what to do with this inheritance. The property was more valuable than he'd initially thought, both financially and emotionally, and the workshop represented a thriving business with a long waiting list of clients. Then there was Abby, clearly integral to his uncle's life and business, now expecting a child and planning to continue William's legacy. What obligation, if any, did he have to her? The sound of her truck approaching pulled him from his thoughts. Today, Abby wore faded jeans and a loose chambray shirt, her hair tied back in a simple ponytail. "You found the letters?" she said, taking in his expression as she climbed the porch steps. James nodded. "He never sent them. He wanted to respect your mother's wishes." Abby lowered herself into the second rocker. "But he couldn't stop caring about you." "Why did you expect to inherit this place?" James asked directly. "Were there promises made?" Abby's hand went instinctively to her rounded belly. "Not in writing, but William always said the business would be mine to carry on." She met his gaze steadily. "I was surprised when Frank told me about the will, that everything went to you, with just a small provision that I could stay in my cabin on the property for as long as I wanted." "Your cabin?" "Through the woods. It was William's first building project here. He lived in it while constructing the main cottage. When I started apprenticing with him, he fixed it up for me." James digested this new information. "So you live on this property already?" 5 years now. I helped William with the business, and he gave me a place to stay and taught me everything he knew." She looked out toward the pond. "When Tyler left and I found out about the baby, William insisted I stay, said we'd figure it out together. But then he died," James finished softly. 3 weeks after Tyler disappeared. Heart attack in his workshop. Her voice caught. "I found him." The silence between them was heavy with unspoken grief. James struggled to reconcile this complex picture of his uncle, master craftsman, mentor, surrogate father, with the vague memories he had of a bearded man in flannel at his father's funeral. "I need to see this cabin," he said finally. They walked together along a narrow path through the woods, morning sunlight filtering through the canopy. After about 5 minutes, they emerged into a smaller clearing where a compact cabin stood. It was obviously built by the same hand as the main cottage, with similar attention to detail, but on a smaller scale. "It's not much," Abby said, leading him inside. "But it's home." The interior was a single room with a small kitchenette, a sitting area with bookshelves, and a curtained-off sleeping space. Despite its size, it was cozy rather than cramped, with large windows bringing in natural light and showcasing the forest views. "William built that for me when he found out about the baby," Abby said, pointing to a beautiful wooden cradle in the corner. "His first piece of baby furniture?" James examined it, noting the exquisite craftsmanship, smooth curves, perfect joinery, a gentle rocking mechanism. "He was talented," James acknowledged, "and generous." "He was family," Abby corrected. "Not by blood, but in all the ways that matter." Back outside, they stood in awkward silence until James spoke. "I have questions about the business. The waiting list, the commissions, the value of the inventory. I can show you the books, Abby offered. William was old-fashioned, kept everything in ledgers rather than computers, but his records are meticulous. In the workshop, Abby retrieved several leather-bound volumes from a cabinet. The most recent one detailed current commissions, prices, deposits received, and estimated completion dates. "These are all outstanding orders?" James asked, scanning the list of furniture pieces and the substantial sums attached to them. 23 active commissions. Some have been waiting 2 years. Abby turned a page. "These are the deposits we're holding. Almost $300,000 total." James whistled softly. "And you can fulfill these orders?" "Most of them." Abby pointed to specific entries. "These 7 pieces I've already been working on. These others are designs William taught me. The last 3—" She hesitated. "They're his signature rocking chairs. I'm not quite there yet with those." "No. So the business would have to refund those deposits, or find another master craftsman to complete them. There's a woman in Knoxville who studied with William years ago. She might be willing." As they continued through the records, James gained a clearer picture of the business. Willow Creek Woodworking grossed approximately $500,000 annually, with materials and overhead accounting for less than 30% of costs. The majority of the value came from William's, and now potentially Abby's, skilled labor. "This is a viable business," James said, closing the ledger. "More than viable, it's thriving." "William never cared much about the money," Abby replied. "He charged what his work was worth, but lived simply. Most of the profits went back into the business or into his savings." "Savings?" Abby looked uncomfortable. "You should talk to Frank about that." Later that afternoon, James drove into town to meet with Frank Thompson again. The lawyer seemed unsurprised by his visit. "Finding out about the business, are you?" Frank asked, gesturing for James to sit. "Why didn't you tell me about it yesterday?" Frank smiled gently. "William was specific about letting you discover things in your own time. So, what questions do you have?" "Abby mentioned savings. What's the financial picture here?" Frank opened a folder. "In addition to the property and business, William left a portfolio valued at approximately $1.2 million, mostly conservative investments, index funds, municipal bonds." James felt slightly dizzy. His uncle, whom he'd vaguely thought of as a drifter, had been not only a renowned craftsman, but also financially savvy. "And it all comes to me?" he asked. "Nothing for Abby?" Frank looked uncomfortable. "William set up a trust for Abby's child, $400,000 for education and care. But the business and property are yours, with the provision that Abby can remain in her cabin as long as she wishes." "Did he explain why?" James pressed. "Why leave everything to a nephew he barely knew, instead of the woman who worked alongside him for years?" Frank hesitated. "He said family connections matter, even broken ones, and he believed you would make the right choice when you understood the full picture." "The right choice about what?" "That's for you to decide." Driving back to the property, James's mind raced. The right choice. What had his uncle meant? Sell everything and return to Boston? Keep the property as a vacation home? Or something else entirely? At the cottage, he found Abby sitting on the porch swing, a book open on her lap. "Did you get your answers?" she asked as he climbed the steps. "Some," he admitted, taking the chair across from her. "Did you know about the trust for your baby?" Abby nodded. "William told me he was setting something aside. I didn't know how much." $400,000. Her eyes widened slightly. "That's more than I expected. But nothing for you directly. No ownership stake in the business you helped build." Abby met his gaze steadily. "What are you getting at, Dr. Bennett?" "James," he corrected automatically. "I'm trying to understand what my uncle intended. Why leave everything to me but expect you to continue the business? It doesn't make sense." "Unless he expected you to be part of the solution," Abby suggested quietly. James fell silent, considering. His uncle's cryptic note about finding treasure, the unfinished desk meant as a gift, The careful documentation of his life and career in unsent letters all pointed to a man who, despite their estrangement, had felt a profound connection to his only nephew. "Tell me about my father," he said suddenly. "The man William knew, not the surgeon everyone else saw." Abby's expression softened. "William said Robert was brilliant, but restless. That he loved medicine but chafed at the politics and constraints of hospital practice. That he was never happier than when he was building something with his hands or sailing on the open water." The description didn't match James's memories of his driven, often absent father. "That sounds more like William than my father." William said they were more alike than people realized, two sides of the same coin. "Your father channeled his creativity into surgery, William into woodworking." As the evening shadows lengthened, they continued talking. Abby shared stories William had told her about the Bennett brothers' childhood, adventures in the woods behind their suburban Boston home, tree houses built, model airplanes flown. James found himself laughing at tales of his serious father's youthful hijinks. "I wish I had known him that way," James admitted as darkness fell. "The man in these stories sounds happier than the father I remember." "William said your father changed after your grandfather died, felt responsible for the family, for upholding the Bennett name in medicine." James nodded slowly. "My grandfather was a renowned cardiologist. There was never any question that my father would follow in his footsteps, or that I would follow in my father's." "Is that what you wanted?" Abby asked. The question caught him off guard. "I'm good at what I do, very good." "That's not what I asked." James looked out into the darkness, considering. "I've never really asked myself if there was an alternative. Medicine it was always the path." William said that was the fundamental difference between him and Robert. William always questioned the path, while Robert accepted it. Abby stood with some effort. "I should get back to my cabin. It's been a long day." "I'll walk you," James offered, surprising himself. They moved through the woods in comfortable silence, flashlights illuminating the narrow path. At her door, Abby turned to him. "Tomorrow's your last required day here. What will you do after that?" It was the question he'd been avoiding since discovering the letters. His life in Boston, his practice, his patients, his condo overlooking the harbor, seemed simultaneously very distant and oddly insubstantial. "I don't know yet," he admitted. "But I'm beginning to think my uncle's inheritance isn't just about property and money." Abby smiled, the first genuine smile she'd directed at him. "Now you're starting to understand William." She hesitated, then added, "Whatever you decide, the offer to finish your desk stands. It deserves to be completed." "Thank you," James said, surprised by how much the offer meant to him. "Good night, Abby." Walking back through the moonlit forest, James felt something shifting within him, questions awakening that had lain dormant for years, possibilities emerging that he'd never considered. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He had a single bar of reception here in the woods, enough for a text to come through from his chief resident. "Surgery schedule confirmed for Thursday. New referral from Dr. Patel. Will brief you when you return." His other life, waiting for him. But for the first time, James wondered if there might be room for something else too, something he hadn't known he was missing until now. James spent his third day exploring the full extent of his inheritance. Armed with a hand-drawn map from Abby, he hiked the property's boundaries, discovering hidden spots his uncle had clearly treasured. A small waterfall tumbling over moss-covered rocks, a meadow filled with wildflowers, a ridge offering views across the rolling Tennessee countryside. The physical exertion felt good after years of standing in operating rooms and hunching over microscopes. By midday, his designer shoes were muddy beyond redemption, his shirt clung damply to his back, and he felt more alive than he had in years. At the pond, he found a small dock with a bench at the end. Sitting there, feet dangling above the clear water, James tried to reconcile the competing pulls he felt, back to Boston and his established career, or toward this unexpected connection to his uncle's world. A text from his colleague interrupted his thoughts. Grant committee meeting rescheduled. Needs your input on new funding priorities, critical for neurosurgery department expansion. Reality intruding. James had worked for years to position himself for the department chair when Dr. Goldstein retired next year. Everything was proceeding according to plan. His research was groundbreaking, his surgical outcomes exceptional, his administrative skills recognized. The path was clear. Yet here, surrounded by the peaceful beauty his uncle had chosen, that path suddenly seemed narrow and constraining. When he returned to the cottage, he found Abby on the porch with an elderly man who introduced himself as Harold Griffin. Harold was William's first client, Abby explained, and later his supplier of cherry and walnut from the Griffin family farm. Harold's weathered face crinkled in a smile. William made my wedding furniture 40 years ago, still perfect after 4 decades and 5 grandkids climbing all over it. He fixed James with a keen gaze. You favor him around the eyes. He had that same look when he was puzzling something out. The observation startled James. No one had ever told him he resembled his uncle. I came by to pay my respects, Harold continued, and to let Miss Abby here know I've got some black walnut that's been drying for 3 years. William had first refusal rights on my best lumber. His eyes twinkled. Thought you might want to honor that arrangement. I haven't decided what I'm doing with the business yet, James admitted. Harold nodded, as if this was perfectly reasonable. Well, the wood ain't going nowhere. Been waiting 3 years already. He tipped his hat to Abby. You take care of that little one. Community's ready to help when she arrives. After Harold left, Abby explained that William had been a central figure in Oak Ridge. The town rallied around him when he first moved here with nothing but his truck and some tools. He never forgot that kindness. And now they're rallying around you, James observed. They're good people. Abby hesitated. I've been thinking about your situation. I might have a proposal that could work for both of us. Inside, she spread blueprints across the dining table, plans for expanding the workshop. William and I had been planning this addition for months. More space, better equipment, room to possibly take on an apprentice. Her eyes shone with enthusiasm. The business has always had more demand than we could meet. With an expansion, we could increase production by 40%, maybe more. You're proposing a partnership, James asked, studying the plans. You provide the capital for expansion, maintain ownership of the property, and a stake in the business. I provide the expertise and labor. She met his eyes directly. We could double the current revenue within 2 years. Based on what evidence? These. Abby produced another ledger, this one filled with inquiries and potential commissions they'd had to decline due to capacity constraints. The market for high-end handcrafted furniture is growing, not shrinking. People crave authenticity and craftsmanship in an age of mass production. James was impressed, despite himself. Beneath Abby's rural exterior was clearly a sharp business mind. And what would this partnership look like in practice? I'm a surgeon in Boston, not a furniture maker in Tennessee. A silent partner, at least initially. Quarterly visits to review finances and strategy. She looked down at her hands. And maybe someday you might want to learn a little of what William could have taught you when you have time. The idea was so unexpected that James almost laughed. Him, working with his hands like his uncle, creating furniture instead of performing delicate brain surgeries. Yet something about it called to him, a road not taken, a connection to a family legacy he'd never known existed. I need time to think, he said finally. This is all happening very fast. Of course. Abby gathered the plans. For what it's worth, I think this is what William hoped might happen, a bridge between his world and yours. That evening, James called his department administrator to request an additional week of leave, his first extended absence in 5 years. He cited family matters, ignoring the surprise in her voice. After dinner, he found himself drawn to the workshop again. In the quiet stillness, surrounded by his uncle's tools and creations, James ran his hand along the unfinished desk intended for him. The wood was smooth and warm to the touch, the craftsmanship evident even in its incomplete state. On a workbench lay William's notebook, open to diagrams and notes for the desk. James flipped through the pages, admiring the precise drawings and detailed instructions. On impulse, he picked up a small piece of sandpaper and, following the notes, began to sand a rough edge on one of the drawers. The repetitive motion was soothing, almost meditative. Minutes stretched into an hour as James lost himself in the simple task, feeling a connection to the uncle he'd never known through this basic act of creation. A sound at the door made him look up. Abby stood watching him, a curious expression on her face. "Sorry," James said, setting down the sandpaper. "I was just—" "No need to apologize," she said softly. "It's in your blood, maybe. The Bennett hands." Later that night, unable to sleep, James sat on the porch watching a spectacular display of stars, far more visible here than in the light-polluted skies of Boston. His thoughts kept returning to Abby's proposal and the strange pull he felt toward this place. Could he really maintain a foot in both worlds? The prestigious neurosurgeon in Boston and the silent partner in a rural woodworking business. It seemed impractical, even absurd. Yet the alternative, selling everything and walking away, suddenly felt like betraying not just his uncle's memory, but something in himself he was only beginning to recognize. His phone buzzed with an email from Dr. Goldstein. "James, rumor has it you're considering an extended leave." Poor timing with the department chair decision looming. "Commitment matters. Call me." The implied threat was clear. His carefully constructed career path could be jeopardized by this unexpected detour. James switched off his phone and looked back at the stars. For the first time in his adult life, he wasn't certain of his next move. And strangely, that uncertainty felt like freedom. James's additional week at the cottage passed in a blur of discovery. He split his time between reviewing the business finances, exploring the property, and, to his own surprise, learning the basics of woodworking under Abby's patient guidance. "You have good hands," she observed after he successfully completed a simple joinery exercise. "Steady. Precise. Surgeon's hands," James replied, examining his work with unexpected pride. "Bennett hands," Abby corrected. "William said your father was the same way. Could have been a craftsman if medicine hadn't claimed him." These casual revelations about his father and uncle continued to reshape James's understanding of his family history. The driven surgeon he'd known had apparently once possessed creative talents he'd never shared with his son. On his 5th day, James accompanied Abby to town for the weekly farmers' market. He was taken aback by how many people greeted her, and him, warmly. "Word travels fast," she explained as they browsed stalls of fresh produce. "Everyone knows you're William's nephew." "That I've stayed longer than the required 3 days," James added wryly. "That too." Abby selected a basket of berries. "People are curious about your intentions." "So am I," James admitted. At Mabel's diner, they took a corner booth. James ordered his first-ever chicken-fried steak, while Abby chose pancakes. The baby wants maple syrup today. "Can I ask you something personal?" James ventured when their food arrived. "Depends on what it is," Abby replied cautiously. "Your husband, ex-husband, did you love him?" Abby's fork paused midway to her mouth. "That is personal." After a moment's hesitation, she continued. "Yes, I did. Tyler was charming, handsome, full of big dreams. We were high school sweethearts." Her expression softened with memory, then hardened. "But love isn't enough if there's no foundation, no character." "What happened?" "Reality happened. His music career stalled. Bills piled up. Then I got pregnant, and suddenly his freedom meant more to him than we did." She cut her pancakes with more force than necessary. "William said some men aren't meant for roots. Tyler was one of them." "And you?" James asked. "Are you meant for roots?" Abby looked up, meeting his gaze directly. "I believe in building something that lasts. A home, a family, a legacy of craftsmanship. That's what matters to me." Her certainty struck James. When was the last time he'd asked himself what truly mattered to him? His career goals had been so clear, so predetermined, that he'd never questioned whether they aligned with his deeper values. "What about you, Dr. Bennett?" Abby asked, turning the tables. "What matters to you beyond surgical excellence and professional advancement?" The question caught him off guard. "I save lives," he said automatically. "That matters." "Of course it does," Abby acknowledged. "But is that all there is to James Bennett?" The question lingered as they finished their meal in thoughtful silence. That afternoon, Frank Thompson called with news that the formal inheritance paperwork was ready. James drove into town, his mind still wrestling with Abby's question. At the law office, Frank seemed pleased to see him. "Still in Tennessee, I see. Finding what William hoped you would?" "Maybe," James admitted. "It's complicated. Life usually is." Frank slid a folder across his desk. "These documents transfer everything to your name. Property, accounts, business assets. All you need to do is sign." James scanned the papers, then looked up. "If I wanted to modify this arrangement, create a partnership for the business, for instance, how would that work?" Frank's eyes twinkled. "I thought you might ask that. I took the liberty of drafting some alternative paperwork." He produced another folder. "A partnership agreement giving Ms. Foster a 49% stake in Willow Creek Woodworking, with you retaining 51% and full ownership of the property." James raised an eyebrow. "You anticipated this?" "William knew you better than you might think," Frank replied cryptically. "He believed when faced with the full picture, you'd see value beyond the monetary." On his drive back, James pulled over at the ridge overlooking his uncle's, now his, property. The cottage and workshop nestled in the clearing, the pond reflecting the late afternoon sun, the forest stretching toward distant hills. It all looked impossibly peaceful from this vantage point. His phone, which he'd reluctantly turned back on for the meeting with Frank, chimed with a message from Dr. Goldstein. "Board meeting tomorrow. Your presence requested via video call to discuss your research funding and future with the department. 9 a.m. sharp." The implied ultimatum was clear. His extended absence had consequences. The career path he'd pursued single-mindedly for decades was at risk. Yet as he gazed down at his inheritance, James felt strangely calm. For the first time, he was seeing choices rather than obligations, possibilities rather than expectations. Back at the cottage, he found Abby in the workshop, carefully shaping a piece of cherry wood for a commission. "How did it go with Frank?" she asked without looking up from her work. "He had partnership papers already drawn up," James replied, watching her hands move with confident precision, almost as if he expected it. Abby smiled slightly. "Frank and William were close friends for 40 years. They understood each other." "Did they understand me, a man neither of them really knew?" Setting down her tools, Abby wiped her hands on her apron. "William kept every article about your surgical innovations, followed your career obsessively. He said you had your father's brilliance but his own questioning spirit, whether you knew it or not." She met his gaze directly. "He believed that eventually you'd need more than just professional success." "And what do you believe?" James asked quietly. "I believe people are complicated, that we contain contradictions." She gestured around the workshop. "A brilliant neurosurgeon can also appreciate handcrafted beauty. A pregnant furniture maker can also have a head for business." James nodded slowly. "I have a video call tomorrow that might determine the future of my medical career." "Important?" "Very." "Then you should take it in town. The Wi-Fi at Mabel's is reliable." Her practical response, free of judgment or pressure, somehow clarified things for James. Whatever decision he made would be his own, not a response to others' expectations. That night, James sat at his uncle's desk, drafting notes for the board meeting. But instead of the desperate justification he'd initially planned, he found himself writing something entirely different, a proposal for a modified role that would allow him to maintain his surgical practice while reducing administrative duties and research expectations. It wasn't the department chair track he'd been pursuing. It was something new, a hybrid path that might allow room for the unexpected inheritance that had become about so much more than property and money. As midnight approached, James reached a decision. He would sign the partnership agreement. He would propose his modified role to the board. And he would see if it was possible to build a life that honored both the legacy he'd unexpectedly discovered and the career he'd worked so hard to build. It wouldn't be easy. Boston and Tennessee were far apart in more ways than geography. But for the first time in years, James felt like he was choosing his path rather than simply following one laid out for him. Tomorrow would bring challenges, but tonight, in the quiet cottage his uncle had built with his own hands, James Bennett slept more peacefully than he had in years. The morning of the board meeting dawned clear and warm. James dressed carefully in the one suit he'd brought, feeling strangely calm despite the stakes. At Mabel's diner, the owner herself ushered him to a quiet corner table with good lighting and strong Wi-Fi. "Heard you might be sticking around," Mabel commented, pouring his coffee. "Good to see William's place staying in the family." News traveled fast in small towns. "It's complicated," James replied, setting up his laptop. "Life worth living usually is, honey." At precisely 9 o'clock, James connected to the video call. Dr. Goldstein's stern face appeared, flanked by several board members James recognized. "James," Goldstein began without preamble, "your unexpected extended absence has raised concerns about your commitment to the department chair track. We need to discuss your intentions moving forward." I appreciate the opportunity," James replied evenly. "I've been dealing with an unexpected inheritance from my late uncle, which has required my presence in Tennessee." "We understand personal matters arise," another board member interjected, "but the timing is unfortunate, with the department leadership transition approaching." James took a deep breath. "I've been giving that considerable thought. I'd like to propose an alternative arrangement." For the next 15 minutes, he outlined his proposal, continuing his surgical practice and mentoring residents while stepping back from administrative duties and the department chair track. He would maintain his research, but at a reduced pace that would allow him to split his time between Boston and Tennessee. The silence that followed was heavy with disapproval. "This is unexpected," Goldstein finally said. "You've been positioning yourself for department leadership for years. To step away now seems impulsive." "On the contrary," James countered, surprising himself with his conviction. "It's the result of careful consideration about what matters most to me, professionally and personally." The discussion grew heated at times, but James remained steady. When the call ended, nothing was resolved, except that the board would consider his proposal and reconvene in 2 weeks. As James closed his laptop, he realized Mabel had been keeping his coffee cup filled throughout the meeting. "Sounded intense," she observed, sliding a slice of pie in front of him. "On the house. You look like you need it." "Thank you," James said, suddenly aware he'd barely eaten breakfast. It was clarifying. Back at the cottage, he found Abby waiting on the porch. "How did it go?" she asked as he climbed the steps. "They're not pleased, but they didn't say no." Abby studied his face. "And how do you feel about it?" "Lighter," James admitted. "As if I've set down something heavy I've been carrying for years without realizing it." She smiled, understanding in her eyes. "William would say that's worth more than any promotion." That afternoon, they finalized the partnership agreement in Frank's office. James officially retained ownership of the property while giving Abby a 49% stake in Willow Creek Woodworking. They established a business plan that would allow for the workshop expansion Abby had envisioned, with James providing the necessary capital. "There's one more thing," James said as they signed the final papers. "The trust for your child. I want to match it with an equal amount for you personally." Abby stared at him. "That's not necessary." "It is to me," James insisted. "You were there for my uncle when his family wasn't. You deserve security, regardless of how the business performs." After a moment, Abby nodded, unexpectedly emotional. William would approve. That evening, they celebrated their partnership with dinner at the cottage. Abby had brought ingredients to cook, dismissing James's offer to drive into town for takeout. "First rule of Tennessee living, learn to make a proper meal," she teased, putting him to work chopping vegetables. As they worked side by side in the small kitchen, James found himself more relaxed than he'd been in years. Their conversation flowed easily, punctuated by laughter, as Abby shared stories of William's kitchen disasters. He could craft a perfect dovetail joint, but somehow managed to burn water, she recalled fondly. "Maybe it runs in the family," James admitted. "I've subsisted mainly on hospital cafeteria food and takeout for a decade." "Well, that ends now," Abby declared. "At least when you're here." The words hung between them, an acknowledgement of the unusual arrangement they were embarking on. Over dinner, they discussed practicalities. James would return to Boston the following week, but come back monthly for long weekends. They would communicate regularly about business decisions. The workshop expansion would begin immediately. "And the unfinished desk?" Abby asked, clearing their plates. "I'd like you to complete it," James said, "for my Boston apartment. A piece of Tennessee there." "I'd be honored," she hesitated. "And will you want to learn more about woodworking when you visit?" The question carried weight beyond the simple words. Was this truly a partnership in spirit as well as legality? "I would," James said, surprising himself with how much he meant it. "I think my uncle and my father would have wanted that." The next morning, James awoke early and walked to the workshop alone. Inside, he stood among his uncle's tools and creations, feeling a sense of continuity that transcended the years of estrangement. He ran his hand over the unfinished desk, imagining it completed and placed in his minimalist Boston apartment, a bridge between his worlds. Then, on impulse, he picked up a small piece of cherry wood and one of the simpler tools. Following the techniques Abby had shown him, he began to shape the wood, feeling its resistance and yield beneath his surgeon's hands. An hour later, Abby found him there, absorbed in his task. She watched silently from the doorway until he looked up. "Not bad," she said, examining his work. "You might have some Bennett in you after all." "It seems I do," James agreed. Later that day, as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the clearing, they stood on the porch of the cottage, finalizing plans for his departure and return. "The expansion contractor will start next week," Abby said. "I'll send you photos of the progress." James nodded, then asked the question that had been forming in his mind. Did my uncle believe I would choose this path? This balance between worlds? Abby considered this. "I think he hoped you might find something here that was missing in your life. Something he and your father once shared, but lost." She met his gaze directly. "William always said that success without meaning is an empty achievement, and meaning comes from connection, to people, to work that matters, to something larger than yourself." She smiled softly. "William found it here after years of searching. Your father found it in medicine, but lost something else along the way." "And what have I found?" James wondered aloud. "Maybe the beginning of a middle path," Abby suggested. "A way to honor all parts of yourself." Her hand rested briefly on her rounded belly. "Life rarely gives us perfect solutions, just opportunities to grow beyond what we thought possible." As sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, James realized with sudden clarity that his uncle's true gift hadn't been the property or business, but this chance to rewrite his understanding of success, family, and fulfillment. 6 weeks later, James returned to Tennessee as promised. The workshop expansion was well underway, with new walls framed and a foundation poured for the addition. Abby met him at the cottage, her pregnancy now in its final weeks. "Perfect timing," she greeted him. "I finished your desk yesterday." In the workshop, covered with a cloth, stood the completed piece. Abby pulled away the covering to reveal a masterpiece, the neural network pattern in the wood now fully realized, the proportions perfect, the finish glowing with depth and warmth. "It's beautiful," James said, genuinely moved. "Better than I could have imagined." William designed it specifically for you, Abby reminded him. I just finished what he started. That evening, as they sat on the porch discussing business and plans, Abby suddenly winced, her hand going to her belly. Are you all right? James asked, instantly alert. I think, she said with a mixture of alarm and excitement, your timing might have been even better than we thought. The baby's coming. Hours later, in the small regional hospital where Abby had insisted on delivering, James found himself in an unexpected role. Not as a surgeon, but as birth coach and support person for a woman who had become, against all odds, a friend and partner. When the tiny girl finally arrived, pink and perfect with a shock of dark hair, Abby looked up at James with tears in her eyes. Would you like to hold her? Carefully, James took the swaddled newborn in his hands, the same hands that performed delicate brain surgeries, that were learning to shape wood, that had found their way back to a family legacy he'd never known existed. Hello, he whispered to the tiny face. Welcome to a very interesting world. 2 days later, mother and daughter returned to the cottage where James had prepared the small second bedroom as a temporary nursery until Abby's cabin could be properly outfitted. I've been thinking about names, Abby said, as they settled the sleeping infant in the handcrafted cradle William had made. What do you think of Willow? For the creek that runs through the property, and for William, of course. Willow Bennett Foster, James said softly. It's perfect. Bennett? Abby looked up, surprised. If that's all right, she's part of this story too now. Abby's eyes filled with tears. William would have loved that. That night, as moonlight filtered through the windows of the cottage, James stood looking out at the property, his inheritance that had become so much more than land and buildings. In 6 months, his life had transformed in ways he could never have anticipated. His medical career continued in Boston, though on a different track than he'd planned. His newly discovered connection to craftsmanship was growing through monthly lessons with Abby. And now there was little Willow, carrying his family name into a future full of possibilities. In the morning, he would help Abby and the baby settle more permanently. The following week, he would return to Boston, taking the desk, his uncle's final gift, to grace his apartment. And in a month, he would be back again, continuing this unexpected journey between worlds. James thought about the title deed in his desk drawer, proof of ownership of this piece of Tennessee heaven. But the true value of his inheritance couldn't be captured in legal documents. It lived in the connections restored and created, in the balance found, in doors opened rather than closed. His uncle's words from that first note echoed in his mind. Open your eyes, open your heart. You've achieved every external success a man could want. But there are other kinds of riches. Standing in the doorway of the cottage his uncle had built, James Bennett, neurosurgeon, woodworking apprentice, reluctant heir turned willing partner, finally understood exactly what William had meant.